I don't know how you're faring this morning, but the Sahara Desert is killing my throat. And so we're going to try to get through the sermon today. I did a funeral service yesterday for a family that didn't have a church, and it was pretty tough getting through the service with burning throat and all, and it's back today. So I apologize if the voice goes, but you'll be glad. And so we'll see. There was a hospital that had a young intern on staff for a little while. And they noticed that as he was assigned to the children's part of the hospital, that the children became very cooperative with him and with those that were working with them because of him. And they didn't know exactly what was going on, but the kids would do things gladly for him and in their treatment that they wouldn't do for anybody else. So they assigned a nurse to the doctor, and she was to go around with the doctor and to observe some of the things that he was doing, because if there was some little secret that they could get and tell the other doctors and other workers, they would get better cooperation out of the kids. Well, for the first week, she didn't really notice anything as they went around, did rounds together, and all the things that doctors and nurses work on in the hospital. But then they went to the night shift. And the nurse observed that every night when it was time for the children to go to bed, this young intern would go to the children and he would hug them and kiss them and tuck them in and express to them a kind of compassion that stirred them to want to respond in a positive way to the doctor. That kind of compassion belongs to Jesus. That's one of the things that really reaches out to us and affects us as followers of His. I remember my routine for my personal Bible study is every other book of the Bible that I read for my personal devotions is a gospel. So I'll read something from the Old Testament, I'll read a gospel. I'll read something from Paul's epistles, and I read a gospel. And on and on. Every other time I read a gospel. And I remember one morning as I was going through and reading, I think it was the Gospel of Mark, over and over and over, I made a notation about the compassion of Jesus. Jesus did this, compassion. Jesus did that, compassion. And it really struck me that one of the driving factors and forces about Jesus is the depth of compassion that He has for us. And that's who our God is. Exodus 34, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Our God abounds in these qualities, and we could kind of summarize that as you think about how He deals with us. We could kind of summarize these qualities as compassion. And He says for us in Deuteronomy 15, there will never cease to be the poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. And what's He say to us? Not only is God compassionate, but you and I are to be compassionate as well. Compassion in both the Greek and the Hebrew carry with it the idea of love and mercy and pity and sympathy. And one of the things that we think about and recognize about compassion is that compassion flows from strength to weakness. That the strong exhibit compassion to the weak, to those in need. About 2.5 years ago, my wife passed away. Many of you reached out to me in compassion. You had a better place of mental, spiritual fitness than I did. And you reached out in your strength to my weakness. That's compassion. And you think about the God of heaven, and you think about how God deals with us. He is the strength, and we are the weakness. Paul says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And that's regularly for us, isn't it? There are two aspects of the compassion of Jesus that I want us to think about this morning. First of all, Jesus is God's expression of compassion. When Jesus came into the world, this was God saying to us, I'm a compassionate God, and I've sent my Son to display that compassion. And there are many areas, and this lesson is not going to cover everything, but there are many areas, many people that Jesus showed compassion in his time in the world. And isn't it interesting that Jesus was only ministering about 3 years, and we just have a few days of the life of Jesus during those 3 years? And in that time, Jesus did amazing amounts of activity, including displaying the compassion of God. Think first of all about the compassion that Jesus has for children. Matthew 19, verse 14, let the children, little children, come to me. Do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. When you think about the compassion Jesus has, you've got to begin with the children. Just like that doctor in the hospital, as he was compassionate towards the children, Jesus is compassionate towards those people, those children that the disciples would have just brushed away. And Jesus says, no, no, no. Let the children come to me. I have compassion, I have care, I have concern, I have a blessing for the children. Wonder where Jesus would be today if he was physically here in the world with us. Where would Jesus be today about the children? About the children that are being aborted? About the children who are experiencing being trafficked for sexual reasons or some forms of slavery in the world? Hearing a lot about slavery today, but it's not a dead institution. Slavery exists, and millions of people today are wrapped up in it by those who would oppress them. Where would Jesus be with pedophilia? Where would Jesus be with child pornography? And on and on and on. Where would Jesus stand? What would Jesus do in regard to those things? Jesus has compassion for the children. But he also has compassion for the outcasts of various kinds. Matthew 14, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. He had compassion on them and healed their sick. Jesus reached out to those who were battling illness. Wonder where Jesus would have been in COVID-19. Wonder what Jesus would have been doing during the lockdown. Wonder what Jesus would be concerned about among people. You see, Jesus reached out to people like lepers, a woman with the unclean issue of blood, and others. And he reached out to those who were ill in a variety of ways. And Jesus went to the outcast, and the outcast came to him. There are other kinds of outcasts in Jesus' society. There were tax collectors that people hated. They were essentially cast out of the society. What did Jesus do? Matthew is invited to become part of his band of 12. Not just one of the disciples, but one of the innermost disciples. Jesus blesses Zacchaeus, one of the chief tax collectors, and he blesses him with his presence at his house. Jesus expressed compassion for those who were cast out in his society. He expresses compassion for those who are downtrodden. I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I am unwilling to send them away hungry lest they faint on the way. Here Jesus is expressing his concern for those who were hungry as he's about to feed the 4,000. Here Jesus expresses these who are downtrodden because of the hunger that they're feeling, and Jesus says, I've got compassion on these folks, and I'm going to take care of the issue. To those who were mourning, we think about Mary and Martha in John chapter 11, and how Jesus was notified of Lazarus' illness, but he doesn't come. He waits until Lazarus dies, and then both Mary and Martha say to him when he arrives, if you had just been here, our brother wouldn't have died. Well, this is for the glory of God. And he goes to the cemetery and he has them roll away the stone and he calls Lazarus out. But before he did that, Jesus wept. We all experience pain and loss and of various kinds. One of the lessons that we read about and that we understand as Jesus stood in that cemetery is that we are not alone in our times of sorrow, whatever it may be. That Jesus knows and Jesus weeps with us in those times. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." In that case, Jesus comforts both Mary and Martha. Notice, too, that there are those oppressed people. All kinds of folks were oppressed in Jesus' day. One of the groups of oppressed people were the women of the time. Women were not allowed to be witnesses in courts of law in the Jewish society. They weren't trusted as witnesses. But what did the angel do when the women came to the tomb and Jesus was alive? Go quickly, he said to them, tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. These women, who were oppressed in much of the society of the day, were given the opportunity and the privilege to be witnesses of Jesus' resurrection to the men disciples that Jesus had been with during those 3 or so years of ministry. He raised their status. He gave them a great privilege. But Jesus met with other women who were oppressed in various ways. He met with the woman caught in adultery. You remember the story. Person after person says she needs to die. The law says stone her to death. What do you say, Jesus? Jesus says, well, you know what? You who are without sin, you cast the first stone. And from oldest to youngest, all the ones demanding her death went away. Where's your accuser? He says to her. There are none. I don't accuse you either. Here's this downtrodden, oppressed woman that, according to the Torah, deserved to die, but there weren't 2 witnesses to stand against her. I don't condemn you either. You go and you sin no more. Now, I'm not overlooking your sin. I'm not upholding your sin, telling you not to do it again. But instead of beating her down, he raises her up. In John chapter 4, there was another incident. A woman at a well in Samaria. She comes out about noon to draw water from the well, and Jesus is there, and he begins a conversation with her. Now, there are a couple of issues with this. Number one, it's a woman, and he's a man, and normally that kind of conversation didn't happen. Number two, he's a Jew and she's a Samaritan. Here's this Samaritan woman that Jesus takes the time to converse with, to talk to point out her life to her, and eventually declares to her that he is the Messiah. So impressed is she that she goes into the town and brings them to Jesus, and he stays with them about 3 days. Teaches. The racial difference, there's a gender difference. And Jesus overcomes those barriers to lift this Samaritan woman and give her a high standing among her people. There are crowds who were oppressed in the days of Jesus. The Romans were oppressing the people. And Jesus in Matthew 9 says he had compassion for them. Mark says he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus knew that not only was he going to die, he knew that 70 AD was coming in which the Romans would destroy the temple and the city of Jerusalem and drive the Jewish people out of that area. Jesus had compassion on the downtrodden, oppressed people because they were like sheep without shepherd, bouncing from one place to the next. But Jesus also expresses God's compassion. He embodies it, but then he also expresses it. The words that he speaks will often display the compassion of God. Jesus tells in Luke 15 of God's compassion for the lost. And in this account, Luke 15, we see that Jesus tells a parable, Luke says. And the parable subdivides itself into three little stories. The first of these deals with a loss of direction in life. Jesus says, there was a shepherd. He had 100 sheep. One of the sheep wanders away. He has 99 left. What does the shepherd do? He goes out into the highways and byways and hedges and wilderness, and he looks for that one lost sheep, and he brings him home. That sheep, for whatever reason, got away from the rest of the flock, and he got lost. He lost his direction. He knew he was lost, but he didn't know how to get home. So the shepherd, in compassion, goes out after that lost sheep. The Bible tells us over and over and over that God comes looking for us. That's one of the reasons Jesus came. But here's the sheep that's wandered away that needs to come home, and the shepherd goes and brings him back out of the path. The other story is a little bit different. There's a woman who had 10 coins. She lost one in her house. She can't find it. Those of you that have been to Capernaum, and you remember the ruins of those houses there at Capernaum, you remember how rocky and uneven and cracked those floors of those houses were. And so you can imagine having the roof on, and of course those houses there are without the roof, but just imagine the roof and hardly any window or ventilation, and then it's dark in there, and the woman loses one of those 10 coins. Then she begins searching. Now that coin represents a loss of value, loss of completion. The 10 coins may have been her dowry after her wedding. Maybe they were put together in a piece that she would wear on her head or a necklace that she would have worn around her neck on occasion. Whatever it was, she's lost one of those coins. Now the coin is an inanimate object. It can't think or talk or whatever. So we look at that coin and we see that that coin is lost, and because it's inanimate, it doesn't know it's lost, and it doesn't know it needs to come home. But the woman searches to reclaim the value of that coin. That's God searching, because people are valuable to God. Every person is valuable to God. And God seeks, especially those who may be lost and don't know they're lost. And it seems to me that there's a lot of that going on in our country today. That there's a lot of people that are expressing a lot of anger and resentment and many difficult situations, expressing a need for something they don't know they're lacking. God says there are people who are lost, who don't know they're lost, who need to come home. The last, you remember, is the loss of identity. Here is the son who demands his inheritance from his father, receives that inheritance and goes to the far country, goes to that area of the Decapolis, wastes his income, wastes his inheritance. That's what prodigal means, waste. Finally, after the famine hits and all the issues are there, the son says, my father's house servants are doing real well. I need to go back home. He comes to himself and he gets up and he heads home. This is the person who's lost, who knows he's lost, and he knows how to get home. And a long way off, the father sees the son coming home and humiliates himself by running to meet his son. And he brings him home and he restores him to his place. Jesus tells this parable, and he speaks of the compassion of God. And then he tells us another parable in Luke chapter 10. He tells us the parable of the Good Samaritan, because he tells us that we ought to represent and reflect and show this kind of compassion as well. And very quickly, you remember the story, and if you don't, go back and read Luke 10. It's an interesting story, but it's based on the question, what's the greatest command? What's the Bible say, Jesus? I said, love God, love your neighbor. Yeah, that you've answered correctly. But then the man wants to justify himself. You see, the man, just picture this for a minute. You have the opportunity to address the greatest teacher in the world. What are you going to ask him? This man asks Jesus a kindergarten question. Anybody in Israel can answer this one. Love God, love your neighbor. Everything else, one of the rabbis said, everything else is commentary. This is what it's all about, loving God, loving others. But the man tries to justify himself. Now I'm embarrassed. And I ask an easy question to Jesus. I'm going to ask him a harder one. I'm going to really put the rabbi to the test. Okay, Rabbi, who's my neighbor? Guy next door? The Jewish people? Is it the hated Samaritans? Is it those pagans that are oppressing us? Right. Jesus said, let me tell you a story. And the story is, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And thieves beat him up and robbed him, left him for dead. And if a Pharisee was telling this story, he would tell it like this. Along comes a priest, along comes a Levite, and they walk on the other side of the road. Now, I'm a Pharisee telling the story. And then along comes a Pharisee. He's the hero. He does it right. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus said, and a Samaritan. Kidding. A Samaritan? He did it right. He took care of the man, bandaged him up, took him to the inn, paid for his keep. He owes more, I'll pay more. And he took care. At the end of the story, he asked the man, who was the neighbor in that story? The man that did right. Samaritan. You go and you do likewise. You be a neighbor. Now here's a Samaritan that overcame racial difference. The Samaritans were half Jewish, half pagan. They worshiped on the wrong mountain. They had taken the Torah of Moses and they adjusted it a little bit. So they edited the words of Moses. They observed the 5 books of Moses, that's all. So the Jewish people disliked them partly because they were racially different, but partly because they were spiritually different. Hated the Samaritans. They would walk around Samaria. Jesus was exceptional walking through when he met the woman at the well. But here is compassion displayed. There are people in our society that are different than we are. This room is, everybody's different one way or another. There are racial differences, there are religious differences in our society, there are any number of differences. We are called on to be people of compassion to everybody. We are called on to be neighbors in difficult times. When you and I remember that every person is created in the image of God, and you remember that when God created Adam, he breathed into Adam the breath of life. God's Spirit was within Adam. And then you look around, and all we got to do is start right here in this room. Look around right now, and you don't see just people. You see people who are made in the image of God. You see image bearers of God. Every breath you take, Spirit of God. When I look at you, I don't just see flesh and blood. I see the image of God filled with the Spirit of God with every breath. If I can remember that, regardless my skin color is different than yours, regardless of my background, I can remember the image of God and the breath of God, I can treat you as a neighbor should treat you. We had in our society years ago what we called the Underground Railroad. That Underground Railroad was set up to bring slaves out of the South and into freedom in the North in places like Canada and other locations. I just found out that the origin of the Wesleyan church denomination came out of the Civil War era when they decided they were going to be very strong abolitionists and that they were going to participate in the Underground Railroad. And they set up their churches about one day's journey apart, so that as they took those slaves from this church to this church, they'd only have about a day's journey, and then they could hide, and then the next day they could move to the next church and the next church and so on until those slaves got their freedom. What I found out was that a lot of those preachers in those Wesleyan churches were hanged because they were aiding the slaves that were escaping instead of bringing them back to their plantation. Why did white Wesleyan preachers and others try to rescue slaves from the South? They had compassion. If you go to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, there is, next to the museum, an avenue of trees. They call it the Avenue of the Righteous. And on those trees are little plaques with the names of Gentiles who saved Jewish people during World War II. Jewish people that were being taken to the Holocaust, their lives were being lost, but some Gentiles said, this isn't right, and we're going to rescue them. No profit. We're going to risk our lives to save theirs. And there are many stories where some of these Gentile people didn't save their own lives, let alone the lives of the Jewish people, but they tried. And the Jewish people honor those Gentiles because they had compassion on the weaker. There's a story of 1943 in Bulgaria. Nazis had, the nation of Bulgaria had aligned with the Nazis. The Nazis sent word that Bulgaria was to exterminate all the Jews by sending them to concentration camps like the concentration camp of Treblinka, one of the worst. You've heard of Auschwitz, and there's some others. Treblinka was one of the really bad ones. So what they would do is they would gather the Jewish people in central locations. One of those locations was the town of Plodda, Plodda. They brought in Jews from 3 towns to Plodda. They put them at an elementary school, put up a large chain-link fence, and as the Jews were gathered there, they cried out to their neighbors and friends. The Jews knew what was happening. And they cried out to say goodbye to their neighbors, friends that they had made, tears streaming down their face. There was an Orthodox bishop named Kurel who came to investigate what was going on. The king of Bulgaria and its parliament didn't want to do this, but because of the pressure of the Nazis, they had given in. And Kurel came to investigate. Is this really true? That they're lining up hundreds of boxcars and trains and putting Jewish people on these trains and taking them to Treblinka and other concentration camps. He came and he saw, and he was stunned at what he had seen. And this bishop said to the Jewish people, children, the Christians of this country will not allow this to happen to you. I will not allow this to happen to you. I will lay my body on these tracks, and they will have to run over my body. This will not happen to you. And then the people began to speak out. And others began to speak out. Members of Parliament began to speak out, and they were taken out of Parliament, and they were never allowed to serve again. But the people refused to let the trains leave. The German ambassador contacted Berlin, explained to the powers that be, that were, what had happened. And he said to them, you've got to understand, they're not as enlightened as we are. They were enlightened, not with hatred. They were enlightened with compassion. We will not give in to Adolf Hitler. And it may be that they're going to run the trains over my body, but we will not give in. Many years ago in Northern Virginia, there was a man standing at a river crossing. And he wanted to cross the river, but he was on foot. There was no ferry. A group of horsemen came riding up. 4 horsemen crossed the river, but the 5th horseman, the man stopped. And he said, would you give me a ride across the river? The rider agreed. Put him on his horse. They went across the river. The man thanked him. He got off his horse. He looked at the rider. And the rider said, I've got to ask you a question. 4 others went before me, and you didn't stop any one of them, but you stopped me and asked me for the ride. Why is that? The man said, it's because of your eyes. I looked into the eyes of each of the other men, and I saw that they would not care for me. But you had eyes of compassion. And I knew you would stop and give me a ride. Well, the rider was kind of humbled by what the man had said, and he thanked him. And then Thomas Jefferson rode back to the White House. Man of compassion, eyes. What do your eyes show when people look at you? When they look into our eyes, do they see compassion, mercy, goodness? Or do they see something else? We have a unique opportunity in our day and time to be people who are compassionate, who are neighbors, everybody around us, in one way or another. So I encourage us right now to be those people, to encourage others as we have the opportunity. Express the compassion of God in the ways that Jesus. We're going to stand and sing an invitation song this morning, and if we can serve you today in any way, either to put Christ on in baptism or to respond for prayer, we invite you to come now. So let's stand and let's sing together.